What's up, guys? Welcome to another edition of Before the Whistle, presented by BRK Insurance Group. If your business is looking for the best in employee benefits, commercial property and casualty insurance, or retirement and 401k plan services, there's no one better suited to meet your challenges and build a plan centered around your needs than BRK Insurance Group. What's going on, y'all? And welcome again back to Before the Whistle. I'm your host, Maddy, and I'm going to be doing, as I've kind of said, these weekly episodes as we're getting through these off-season months just a little bit, and just trying to kind of figure out what I want to unpack from a football perspective, where I've spent the last couple of weeks, I tried out a new format this last week, really looking at some film for Tulane and these incoming transfers that Tulane has, offering some edge and pass rush that was very much a need for this team. So we looked at that. I looked at that with Sam Lockwood of Wave After Wave on Twitter, and I really enjoyed that. It was A, just kind of nice to actually get some film and look at it, but B, it was exciting to really look at these guys on tape and see where they could fit in to Tulane's defense. So I've spent the last week, if you will, kind of trying to figure that out. And I'll admit, I am still getting there a little bit. The schedule dropped today, and I think that kind of took my attention for a little bit, or at least some of it, where we got 6 of the times and channels, I guess, for Tulane this year, where they open up against Southeastern Louisiana. It's a Thursday night game on the 29th, and that'll be on ESPN Plus at 7 p.m. Then we have a scorcher where Kansas State comes to Yeoman Stadium on September 7th. That'll be on ESPN or ESPN2 for a really nice 11 a.m. Central Time kickoff. And then we'll go to Oklahoma. That's at 2:30 p.m. On the 14th. We have a time for Charlotte, 6:30 p.m. on ESPN Plus on Halloween, because why should we have holidays when we could do college football on every single one of them? Then going back to Navy on the 16th, that game's at 11 a.m. TV schedule TBD. Then we'll have a very late in the year bye for Tulane and one more holiday, because why not? They will play Memphis on Thanksgiving, and that time came out for 6:30 p.m. on ESPN. And now they'll no longer be competing with the Egg Bowl, if you will, with that game with Ole Miss. I think it's Ole Miss and Southern Miss, and I'm sorry if it's not, being moved to Black Friday. So we're, I guess, just competing with the NFL. Everyone's attention immediately went to that Kansas State game, and rightfully so. I think as the years have gone on, I've realized that with Tulane, at least, in the way that Yeoman Stadium just is, you have to essentially trade off TV times for weather. And as much as we would like to have these night games, television networks really don't agree with that as much. And so I think that you probably might be able to get a better time for the team at the expense of that national exposure. And I just want everyone to think back to 2 seasons ago, where Tulane versus Kansas State was on ESPN Plus. It's still just a little offensive to this day. I get it, coming off of the perception of the 2-10 season and that game being considered a tune-up, but that was when Tulane really had their first shock of the 22 season, and not a lot of eyes got the chance to see it, with their first, I think, primetime game being that one on that Friday night game in Houston. But they were just kind of relegated to one of those lower schedules that year. And then this last season, it was like every week. I think we got until the FAU game, where every game was either on ESPN, ESPN2, or ESPNU. I don't entirely understand all of these channels, but ESPN, ESPN2 being those better ones, and then the Plus being on a streaming service. But I remember just talking with my family last year about how much more they were engaged in Tulane football because they were able to watch the games. My dad included, with them all being in California. And you're kind of just seeing really that Cotton Bowl momentum, I think, just continuing to reverberate, because that puts Tulane on the map. All of a sudden, everyone's like, okay, well, what is this G5 program that just upset the Heisman Trophy winner? And so they got all eyes on them this last season, and they did what they did. And so going into this year, it's really exciting to see that they're getting really that same treatment, if you will, being the top of the conference. But within our conference is not Kansas State, and as such, again, still just left up to TV. So yes, that game is at 11 a.m. We survived the Ole Miss game. We're all essentially going to be in training, if you will, for the next several months, getting prepared for that start date. So I recommend, if you're getting nervous about that, maybe just honestly sitting outside at that time during the summer, and making sure to stay hydrated. I legitimately do that to get ready for training camp, because I know that the weather really does make a difference. And so you do have that advantage really going into this game. I know that the shade is on the other side, but quite frankly, with that 11 a.m. kickoff, pretty sure the sun's going to be directly over us for the majority of that game. So in an odd way, Ole Miss almost had somewhat of a shade advantage last year that I think you will see a little less of against Kansas State. So all that to say in this roundabout, as I'm kind of perusing through what to look at, that game really just stuck out to me. It just is a very good memory for me from that Cotton Bowl year. It's the first game that I've pointed to a lot of times as saying that was really the first game where I genuinely understood the point of being a sideline reporter. Obviously, I understood my job description, but I didn't really get that visceral reaction to a football game until that Kansas State game, where I could just palpably feel the momentum suck out of one side of that stadium. And there was a decent, Tulane contingent that actually showed up there, but these guys are really just thriving on it. And I remember thinking midway, if even through the fourth quarter, Tulane has this game. And it was either tied or a 3-point game. At that point, it was such a close game, such a razor thin margin, but Tulane was just in the driver's seat with 4 fourth down stops. And just really that game put this defense and their tackling ability on the map. But last year to me was really where you saw their defense get solidified in the matchup against Ole Miss, where to me that was such a actually markedly improved pass rush from what you saw against Kansas State. So it kind of went all over the place with this episode. I was kind of looking at those earlier, scheduled games, if you will, just kind of trying to figure out who the quarterback for Kansas State is going to be. And it adds another fascinating wrinkle in this. And I did kind of look at this. Torrey also played Kansas State last year. However, they did not face what I assume will be their starting quarterback in Avery Johnson, who was this true freshman that they pretty much brought off the bench in like week 7 against Texas Tech. And he rushed for 5 touchdowns. I mean, reminds me of Taysom Hill, honestly, and just his ability to run that kind of power scheme up the middle, pretty much all RPOs in that game, and just really having such strong speed, both vertically and to get around. Also reminded me quite a bit of John Rice Plumlee, which for Tulane fans in that 22 year, at first, not the best memories, which, was one of the 2 losses on that year was to UCF. And quite frankly, John Rice Plumlee just kind of ran laps around the defense, if you will. And so that stuck out. And then their quarterback enters the transfer portal. What that allowed for was there to actually kind of be a game where you saw presumably next year's quarterback as that starting guy. And they brought down the runs quite a bit for him, which again, I understand they were probably using him as more of a gadget player. But trying to kind of figure out how much to take away from one game plan, I can only do so much on the spot there. But that's where I really found looking at these other games to be valuable. And this will just kind of be a potpourri episode about a little bit of a continuation of pass rush and just what we can really look forward to, at least from this front 7 for Tulane's defense heading into next year as a whole. It's easy to hear a promo in the middle of a podcast and think, of course they like the product, they're paid to. Well, if you know me at all, then you know 2 things. 1, I'm truthful, as you've seen on this episode, almost to a fault. And 2, if I were in it for the money, I'd certainly be doing something else. So believe me when I say that I love Blue Oak Barbecue. The food, the drinks, the people, the location, yes, all of that. Blue Oak Barbecue has a great selection of your favorites from the smoker, fantastic sides, and awesome bar specials each and every week. Go check them out. Blue Oak Barbecue, located at 900 North Carrollton here in New Orleans, or visit them online at blueoakbarbecue.com. And as we are, a little bit through May now, let me get to those specials for the month of May and go through what we have on tap this week. So as always, Mondays, red beans and rice, keeping it classic here. Tuesdays, we have the braised pork cheek tacos with mango papaya salsa. Wednesdays, we have a house brisket meatball hero. I'm unclear what they have on Thursdays. Friday, crawfish étouffée, yum. Saturday, pork cheek debris sandwich with Creole gravy. And Sunday, you got yourself some biscuits and gravy at Blue Oak Barbecue. So again, bear with me where I might have to pull up some stats here and there, but just kind of thinking back again, that game against Kansas State stuck out for a lot of reasons. One of them being that it was a notably mobile quarterback that Tulane had faced that year. I don't usually have this access to film. And so when I watched this game in the past, as I said, it was on ESPN Plus. I think I found a version of it on YouTube, and you can only see so much on a broadcast. I've been over that a lot before. And so I was really delighted in a way to look at, what would be considered that all 22 end zone version. And just for the sake of trying to figure out how to bring this all together and then watch, the entirety of these games, I really just kind of looked at the pass rush snaps where Tulane was able to get some pressure going against Kansas State, and then how much that correlated with the amount of times they blitzed in that game. Thinking back to that game, I think a lot about the tackling, but I almost can't really remember where it came in. There were quite a few tackles of Adrian Martinez, him being a runner. They shut down Deuce Vaughn in the running game. That was something that probably stuck out more than anything else. But trying to kind of think about the pass rush, looking back on it, I know that the system changed a lot with a different defensive coordinator last year. I remember Patrick Jenkins, I had spoken to him at Media Day last year for Tulane, and he had said to me that something about how much Steele Wood and this new staff was really turning them loose, particularly along the interior, and how excited they were to really get after it this year. And to be honest, it is very night and day, just looking at the difference in those footages, both in what Tulane was doing, but also the quality of who they had on the line. When you go back to that Kansas State game, most of their pressures came as a result of blitzes, but they also had twice as many blitzes that didn't really go anywhere. And that ends up leaving the second level of the field relatively wide open. A lot of blitzing with Dorian Williams and Nick Anderson as those linebackers, bringing in Jesus Machado and Corey Platt. That quarterback couldn't really throw that well. I think that this quarterback is probably going to be able to throw a bit better than Adrian Martinez did at that time, where really just the game plan was shut down Adrian Martinez and contain a mobile quarterback. But I don't really, the containment, I guess, was there in the sense that the plays didn't really get off, but there was a lot that I just kind of saw on Tulane's defensive line of just occupying traffic, aside from those blitzes. And a lot of that is by design. When me and Sam were looking at film, we kind of were talking about what is a 3-4 versus a 4-3 nowadays. And if I'm being entirely transparent, I'm still really trying to get a sense of when to truly call a spade for what it is, and just looking at where the different techniques line up, because as much as Tulane says that they employed a 3-4 last year, that does not include 4 linebackers, because Tulane regularly trotted out there with just 2 linebackers and then having that anchor role be Cam Pettislow. And I understand that they don't necessarily have to be at that linebacker role, but it just didn't traditionally seem like that much of a 3-4 to me. But that's really where I think you get into the 1 gap versus 2 gap system, where I think, if anything, what I saw on tape against Kansas State for Tulane was a lot of that was just those linemen trying to clog up the interior, try to get the edge, something to go off of, but a lot of relying on linebackers and safeties and stuff like that to really generate a pass rush. When I looked at the Ole Miss tape, it was striking, actually. I didn't pick out any particular player in the way that I did with Aiden Huntington and Terrell Allen with Sam last week. I just looked at when Tulane was able to get those pressures going against Ole Miss. And it struck me that almost every single one of them involved Patrick Jenkins in a way. And that much interior pressure, it was very mind-blowing to see as a difference from compared to that Kansas State film, where quite honestly, a lot of the time he was lined up. I saw him a little bit as a 4 and a 4 eye tech, which, to not get into the weeds here, most of the time he's lining up around the center on the inside shoulder of the guard. That's really where the interior is. But sometimes he would be on the inside shoulder of a tackle. Sometimes he would be head on across from them. And that's where, you started to see a little bit of versatility for him. But it just kind of felt like in the scheme that he ran in 2022, he was really meant to occupy double teams. And it almost makes the safety that kind of more shocking, because he just didn't seem to be let loose in the way that I saw on tape. But another big difference to me was you saw some blitzing from Jesus Machado and Tyler Grubbs. We saw it throughout the year quite a bit, but Tulane really just relied on its bread and butter pass rush and, its front 3-4, what have you, to get something going. And notably, really getting those one-on-one matchups for Patrick Jenkins. Yes, he commands quite a bit of double teams, but having him on a side with Devin Deal, which they did quite frequently, really allowed both of them to have those one-on-one opportunities. And then when you're able to collapse a pocket up the middle, that's really where you can get things just absolutely destructive for opposing quarterbacks. So we had looked at all this tape where Terrell Allen, he lined up all over the place. Same with Aiden Huntington. And you get the sense that those guys are going to fill out those edge roles. But what does that really allow Patrick Jenkins to do, I think, is going to be the question that will be the most interesting thing to me here, because you don't normally think about your interior as that kind of premier pass rusher guy. But just looking in that kind of stark difference of what they looked like, for the Power 5 team of the year prior, especially against a mobile quarterback, it just kind of felt like Patrick Jenkins was lost in the shuffle, whereas he was really just the premier guy in all of that Ole Miss tape. And I like I said, I tried to chart a lot of this, but I just noted the amount of times that they were switching him from being lined up either head on with the center or having a little bit of a shade on his shoulder. But most of his pressure is coming from that kind of outside shoulder of the tackle, inside shoulder of the tackle, with Eric Hicks really occupying the center of the defense. So that's something that I'm really curious to see, just as we were talking about in that episode. How do you really line these guys up? Because if there's anything I would point out as the big difference from what you're losing just on its face with the edge rusher guys from last year is about 4 or 5 inches of height. And I'm not entirely sure how much that matters when you're lined up really wide on the edge and you don't have to essentially see over helmets. But I didn't realize Keith Cooper was 6'5". He was 6'5", 275. Devin Deal, 6'4", 245. And Darius Hodges, 6'2", 280. Those are the guys that, to me, you've lost as your exterior rushers. You still have Angelo Anderson. And then Aiden Huntington is 6'1", 281. And Terrell Allen, 6'0", 275. So that is a pretty stark difference in height. And it probably does put those guys kind of better among the exterior things. But looking at this game, looking how this quarterback is going to be, Tulane, to me, mobile quarterbacks have kind of been the end-all be-all for this team, where they either are able to shut them down or those are the games that they don't end up going well for them. They struggled against UCF in that same Cotton Bowl year with quarterbacks that can really get outside of the pocket. But I just think in that Cotton Bowl year, they didn't have the interior pressure and just the command that Patrick Jenkins has. And yeah, he had a little bit of, I guess, that Cotton Bowl lore going into last year. But if you don't think that every team that's playing Tulane this year has Patrick Jenkins circled as that number one player to contain on Tulane's defensive line, I think you're going to see him get that much more star treatment this upcoming year. So I'm going to be curious to see how they use him. Do they continue to try to get him those one-on-one matchups, or is this something where we're going to see a lot more off the edge here? I think it's going to be a very creative team where we've seen Tulane do a lot of stunts in the past, but it felt like 2 seasons ago, it was relying a lot on that zone, keeping the plays in front of them. Last year was kind of just hitting them hard and just these kind of bam plays, if you will. You're going to need that against this team, where I looked at how this guy did against, blitzing and those pressures in their bowl game. And it was either an incomplete pass, most of the time dropped by the player, very good at just quickly getting the ball out over the middle of the field on a ton of those, or just tucking it and going for about 20 yards or so. And that's really where you run into some of the risks, if you will, of blitzing till the cows come home, is you completely vacate that second level of the field. And so if you have a mobile quarterback like this guy, you're really going to need a spy on him. It sticks out to me that John Summerall has said that this defense is really going to match the personnel of the offense in front of them. And that's something you rarely see at a college level. Quite often, you just stick in your base. We saw Tulane employ, those 3 linebacker sets here and there, depending on the team, depending on some plays. But I think we're really going to see just a lot of versatility here for this defensive line for Tulane. But you also truly, and I'm speaking as someone that went to every day of spring camp, is spending, my current time doing this as a scouting position and is able to really kind of piece these things together. I can't necessarily say when you have a new head coach, you have a new defensive coordinator, you have a defensive line coach coming from another team, and then, all of these new players, you have Patrick Jenkins, you have that interior with Eric Hicks, Elijah Champagne, Adonis Freelou, Cam Hamilton for that matter, and you have those exciting guys like Matthew Fobbs-White, Michael Lunds on the edge and Angelo Anderson. But I think you're really going to need to kind of see what's past that. And I, quite frankly, if you ask me how they would line up today, I really can't say for sure. And I really think that works in Tulane's favor. So I guess phase 3, if you will, began today, where they're really starting those workouts again. And this is going to be a really, really important time for these guys. Obviously that's something that I don't attend. That's really team-based, but I hear a lot about those workouts, and you can see how those connections build on top of one another. I could see the January work when I was there at spring camp, but you really want to see a build off of that spring. And we're going to be also looking at quite a lot of different guys on this team. And so getting that chemistry down, getting their identity down, with Vincent Murphy, one of the linemen in that last Welcome to Uptown special, admitting that he doesn't think this team has an identity yet. And I'm inclined to agree with him. I mean, just trying to break down literally one personnel group where I can't definitively say how I think that Tulane is going to scheme here or there, just because of all the interesting things that you have to ponder, where you have these guys like Aiden Huntington, who he was very much of a terror. And we saw it in that Troy game, me and Sam, when we watched it. And he's going to be a guy that you can't ignore out there on the edge. That's really what you saw, especially the times where Patrick Jenkins had so much success, was the respect as much so for Devin Deal, Darius Hodges, Keith Cooper. So you really need that kind of 1-2 punch. So I think while they had a better edge rush the Cotton Bowl year, slightly better, much better interior this next season, you're going to really have to see them put that all together this year, because it's not just getting through one Power 5 team. It's getting through one and then going up to Oklahoma and playing, in the SEC just a week later, being beaten down and probably a little battered. And this game is lost and won at the line of scrimmage, for that matter. So most of my kind of breakdowns of what I'm looking into the future are going to kind of be based on that, at least from a defensive perspective. But I'm still trying to kind of figure out how to break down film in a palatable way that allows you guys to learn some things, but also not to just get too bogged down in the weeds here, where, like I said, I looked at quite a lot of areas. And if I'm being entirely transparent, probably one area too much, but just being able to see the type of vertical penetration that Patrick Jenkins was able to offer in that Ole Miss game time and time again, where, like I said, I didn't click on his highlights. I just clicked on the pressures. And even if he wasn't the guy pressuring them, it very quickly became a disaster up the middle of the field there. And that's going to be something that's really important when you have a team that has that RPO, which is, when there's play action, there's read option, and then there's RPO, where, RPO, you read the defense and the guy quarterback either decides to hold on to it or throw it as a pass. And it wouldn't surprise me if we'd see more read options just based on what this quarterback really looks like. I didn't really look at his film. I looked at some of it in week 7, but it was essentially him just operating as Taysom Hill when he went out there as a quarterback, for Saints fans out there, where it was of no surprise that he was either going to, fake it, hand it off, or just tuck it down and run. And yet that's what this guy was kind of doing time and time again. But they'll now be building kind of an offseason around his strengths. And a lot of that, to me, will be built off of his mobility and reading where that pass rush is coming from. So if they are able to penetrate both vertically and contain him on the edge, that's very nightmarish for opposing offensive coordinators to scheme up, no matter how you put it. And I think that we're really just starting to see this potential unlock here. And I think it all, quite frankly, centers around Patrick Jenkins, where when you're talking about a defensive tackle, where in a game of 10 pressures, he's involved in 8 or 9 of them, and the amount of sacks, hits, and hurries that he had last season. And then you have these guys coming in, you don't know that much about them. You don't know how this new coach is going to employ them whatsoever, even though we're all in this 3-4, if you will. And that to me is really what's the most exciting to look at moving forward. So I'm going to keep kind of looking at these snippets of these games. Someone that caught my eye that I think I might dive into a little more too was Caleb Bransaw, just because it's that same kind of position as Cam Pettisflow. He was so key to this team this last season that, how do we see that role really continue on with a guy like Caleb Bransaw this upcoming year? And then looking at Chris Rogers, who they use as that kind of hybrid linebacker in that role, and some of these incoming transfer guys like Sam Howard, and just doing kind of a recap of the linebackers. I'm getting a little bogged down in football at this point, but there's nothing to watch on TV football wise. So I'm trying to give us as much insight as possible to learn about this Green Wave team and get excited for what is probably the most anticipated season since I have known of Tulane University. And with that, y'all, I will see you next week.